Good evening. Thank you for joining us at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, what we're calling our Know Before You Go reading room. I just want to say we're having some technical difficulties, so we're trying to find a way to reestablish the link with those who are joining in, but we wanted to go ahead and get started and start recording and get our panelists in to start talking as we try to draw in our audience from the other area. So again, greetings and thank you for joining us at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Know Before You Go, Social Justice Thursdays. And tonight we're talking about eating while Black. We'd like for folks to come in the chat and introduce themselves and present their questions in the Q&A. For the last 2 weeks, we've been working hard on presenting to you these wonderful sessions that capture just a little bit of what you're going to see when you come live to the ASALA conference or join in virtually. That's the ASALA 107th Annual Conference in Montgomery, Alabama. Social Justice at ASALA is an interdisciplinary initiative that includes workshops, outreach materials, and fellowships focused on social justice community engagement. This series is brought to you by Howard University Social Justice Consortium and is made possible by the Mellon Just Futures Initiative. But as you might know, if you've been affiliated with ASALA, is that for a long time, ASALA has dealt with issues of social justice. Since its beginning in 1915, being founded by historian Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, ASALA has operated on the premise that racial discrimination must be fought, not only by legal suits in the courtroom and marches in the street, but also by historical knowledge presented inside and outside the classroom. Social Justice at ASALA provides free, I'm going to say that again, free workshops and events, creating a unique opportunity to advance the ASALA and Howard Social Justice Consortium goal of broad public audience participation in social justice. Today's program features Professor Destin Jenkins as Associate Professor of History at Stanford University. And he's going to be leading us through a discussion about his book, The Bonds of Inequality. And tonight's session is The Bonds of Inequality. His work bridges the fields of economic, urban, and political history and focuses on capitalism, democracy, and social movements in the United States during the long 20th century. He's the author of the multi-award-winning book, The Bonds of Inequality, Debt and the Making of the American City. And tonight, our moderator will be Jarvis Givens, an assistant professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He is the award-winning author of the award-winning book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching. And he's won an award from ASALA and will be the keynote speaker for one of ASALA's luncheon sessions. So we hope we'll see you in Montgomery. But without further ado, I want to thank you for joining us, and I'd like to turn it over to Jarvis. Jarvis?
All right, thank you for that introduction, Michelle. And I'm looking forward to folks that are going to be joining us. I know that there was additional kind of step required to access the event through the Eventbrite. An email has been sent out to all of the participants for today, but we want to make sure that we're able to move the program along. especially because we're excited to be here to celebrate Professor Jenkins' wonderful book, as was just introduced. And we have, one of the best ways of celebrating the work that comes out by our colleagues is not just by kind of holding up the text, but actually engaging in dialogue and conversation with the scholarship and with the work. And that's exactly what we're here to do, this evening. So I have the pleasure to now introduce the four wonderful panelists that we have that are going to be engaging in that dialogue before Professor Jenkins comes back to respond to their comments and questions and have a kind of a roundtable conversation. The first person that's going to be speaking to us about this book is Sharice Burton-Stelly. And Sharice Burton-Stelly is an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. And Dr. Burton-Stelly is a critical Black studies scholar of political theory, political and intellectual history, and political economy. And she has published numerous articles, book chapters, editorials, and edited books. And her current monograph, which she's working on, is excellent work, is entitled Black Scare, Red Scare. Followed by that, by Professor Burton-Stelly, we'll have Kyle Mays, who is an associate professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at UCLA. He is a transdisciplinary scholar of urban history and studies, Afro-Indigenous studies, and contemporary popular culture. He is the author of several books, including An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. Following Professor Mays, we'll have Marlos Van Weyenberg, who is an assistant professor in the Business, Government, and International Economy unit at Harvard Business School. Professor Van Weyenberg's main research agenda centers on the long-term development patterns of African economies. To date, her projects have focused on material living standards, fiscal capacity building efforts, coercive labor market institutions, and skill accumulation. And then following that, we'll have Professor Robin McDowell, who is an assistant professor of African and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Her interdisciplinary research explores environmental racism and justice in Louisiana. And her book project is entitled Swamp Capitalism, The Roots of Environmental Racism. And this is a history of bonds between Blackness, ecology, and labor on a geological timescale. So each of these scholars are going to be spending about roughly 10 minutes to offer comments and reflections on the book. And then we'll have the opportunity for Professor Jenkins to respond and engage in dialogue. But I wanted to say to all of you that are here today with us, that if there are questions that come up or comments that you wanted to share for the panelists to respond to, you can share those questions using the Q&A feature. You don't have to wait until the end of the program, because we want to make sure that we build up a set of questions that we have prepared to share with our panelists that we have here today. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Burton-Stelly, who's going to start it off. And then in the order that I introduced them, the panelists will then join in and offer their comments.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, LaShawn Harris, and Jarvis Givens for inviting me to offer some remarks today. Very brief remarks. I will do my best to stay within the 10 minutes. And I also, of course, want to thank my brilliant co-panelists and Dr. Dustin Jenkins for writing this marvelous book. So I just want to start off by saying I was extraordinarily impressed with the structural clarity, clear and engaging writing, and streamlined style of the text. It's actually very readable and accessible, despite the quite complicated topic. And even the footnotes, it's very clean and very pristine. So just the text itself as a sort of, as an offering is very remarkable. So I just wanted to affirm Destin in that way. I want to start off by just offering up some of the takeaways that from Bonds of Inequality and things that I learned about debt financing, which was a lot because I knew nothing about the subject, as Destin points out, right, in the introduction, that many people don't think about debt financing as this technology of not only accumulation, but of race making. Right. And it really, in a general sense, upends our ideas about financialization, neoliberalization, and structural adjustment as temporally bounded in the 1980s. What he shows is that there's a historical development of these processes, not only these processes, but also these discourses that really accrue around the American city. So debt financing through municipal bonds was operated in several ways. The first was as a means of distributing rights and obligations. And so here I'm actually thinking alongside Eram Getacheo's book, World Making After Empire, where she talks about burdened and onerous inclusion of sort of racialized states. There she's talking about Ethiopia and Liberia, but what she points out is that this idea of inclusion and belonging and modernity and development is predicated on putting in a lot basically and getting very little in return, and is fundamentally predicated on different forms of hierarchy making. Debt financing through municipal bonds also was a means of racializing the built environment and spatializing race. And so Destin explains this in a number of ways. One of my favorites was when he talks about the infrastructural investment in whiteness. And then another sort of concrete example was the urban renewal project in the Western Addition Fillmore neighborhood. And so here I thought about how Destin's book is actually a bookend to Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's Race for Profit. I think that it offers a critical reassessment of issues like home ownership, redlining, and space, but it's also very much in conversation with that particular text with a focus on the bond market, obviously. Debt financing through municipal bonds was also a means of constructing and perpetuating belonging and unbelonging, not only along racial lines, but along gender lines and class lines, and also along sort of, even amongst the lenders themselves. There was a way that following a particular script and following evaluative mechanisms allowed for banks to sort of fit in or fall out. Also, this idea of particular municipalities having names to be able to sell debt was also a means of constructing belonging and unbelonging. His rendering of municipal bonds also sort of brought out how authority and privileges were distributed to those responsible for little more than discourse, narration, and legitimation. And here I'm thinking about the bond screening committee, the daily bond buyer, and the various rating agencies that produce absolutely nothing other than discourse, right? And that discourse was able to solidify themselves as people who are able to dominate, right? As people who are able to dictate and determine what the terms of buying and lending were going to be, but they didn't produce anything, right? Except for their own sort of aggrandizement and class position. Again, so these municipal bonds were a means of creating hierarchies between lenders, municipalities, interest groups, city dwellers, classes, and of course, racial groups. There were means of employing regimes of morality sutured to the ability to attract debt and pay for it through abstractions like worthiness, ratings, and names. They were a means of curtailing militancy, fight back, redistribution, and robust social welfare through practices of devaluation, practices that were fundamentally mapped onto Black and poor bodies, right? And they were a means of organizing and arranging time and duration wholly predicated on profit and accumulation. So for example, long-term versus short-term debt. Politics became very much understood in this way in these localities. And also of transforming US social welfare into little more than economic imperatives. So on page 49, Destin writes, the social welfare of Americans had become further entwined with tax advantages, commercial lending demands, and anticipatory yields. Here it has nothing to do with people, well-being, or longevity outside of the sort of profit motive. These municipal bonds were also a way of attacking the federal government through free market discourse, while at the same time enlisting the federal government to underwrite the transfer of wealth from public to private, corporate, and individual coffers. And relatedly, of insisting upon public-private partnership primarily as a means to discipline and subsume the public to the private. So there's another good quote. There's so many bars in here, but there's another quote on page 39 that I just want to read in that regard. So Destin writes, in this parable of debt and governance, dependence on the federal government was dangerous, while dependence on the bond market, credit appraisers, bankers, and fickle investors was virtuous. So it's not that dependence is the problem per se, it's dependence on the federal government that actually at the particular historical moment that Destin is writing about offers fairer terms of lending and fairer terms of building up cities. And finally, the municipal bonds and debt financing were a means of fomenting urban fiscal crisis that ultimately benefited banks and lenders and protected their dominance. And one just very interesting way that Destin talks about this is their speculation in riots, while continuing the structural reliance on debt that held intact the very material foundations of that unrest. And so this is a fundamental contradiction. So I just want to delve deeper into some points of interest that really kind of dovetail with my own work. And first of all, I was very interested in the creation of culture, values, and norms and sociality around municipal bonds and banking. And that discussion in chapter 2 was very much akin to discussion that Peter James Hudson offers in Bankers and Empire, talking about the ways that the culture and racial biases of bankers very much influenced the policies that they imposed upon the Caribbean, Central America, and et cetera. And we see very much the same dynamics happening here. I also was very struck about the various discussions of abstraction as a technique of accumulation, investment and disinvestment, and perpetuation of racial and class hierarchy. I was very much interested in, I have 1 minute, 30 seconds, so I'm gonna skip down to this. In terms of my own work, I talk about Blackness as a relationship of value minus worth. And this actually bore out in Destin's work, where he talks about how Blackness, the presence of Blackness, made borrowing more expensive at the same time that these very Black people bore the burdens of paying for debt. So on the one hand, they lack value, but they're worth a lot because they absorb the disproportionate investment in whiteness. And then also there's a way that municipal bond debt financing was a form of anti-radicalism in a number of ways, by penalizing unrest and protest, by conflating Black and labor militancy, by attacking self-determination in its manifold forms, including the ability of cities to be able to determine the ways that they wanted to build up their cities and organize their citizens, by normalizing white elite capitalist rule, and of course the hostility to democracy. And so I'm going to go slightly over 10 minutes, just 10 and a half minutes. So I did have three sort of questions that I would love to hear Destin say more about. The first is that there seems to be some ambivalence around the use of racial capitalism as a framework. Or description, though the term appears a couple of times in the work, specifically urban racial capitalism. There's also a mention of the forensic profile, which obviously drums up the work of Michael Ralph and Forensics of Capital. But I just wondered, can you speak to this ambivalence and how your usage of the term shifted over the course of perhaps writing and then editing the book? It seemed like it was more central at one point and then perhaps maybe you moved away from it over time. I'm not sure if that was the process, but I'd like to hear more about that. Secondly, I was wondering, how is race made and remade, if at all, through municipal debt? It seems like the categories of whiteness and Blackness were already constituted in the way that you talk about them, and they are just simply acted upon and are relatively static. But it seems to me that there's probably more to that story, so I wondered if you could speak to that. And then finally, I was interested in the categorization of Blacks as racial minorities as a separate category from workers, because when you talked about workers, that tended to be conflated with what seemed to be organized labor. And I just wondered if racial minority was the best categorization of Black people in relationship to the issuing and impact of municipal debt, not least because non-whites meant Negro, right, as you say. And so they seem to operate much more than as a category of simply racial minority. So were you being faithful to the discourse within the newspapers and documents of the time? or I just wondered why Blackness or Black folks were categorized in that way. So again, I just want to thank you so much for this very thought-provoking and generative work. And I look forward to hearing your responses. Thank you.
Well, always hard to follow Charisse in her own brilliance in her own right, but I will give it a shot. So thank you again to my fellow panelists. Glad to be here, and thank you for the organizers, and thank you, Destin, for writing this important and monumental and fantastic book. So, like Sharice, I never have really thought much about debt. I write on Detroit, but I never thought much about it in this particular way. So it's just truly remarkable. So I'll get into it and then end with a series of questions that feel free to engage with and think about it. So it is a pleasure to have read this incredible book by Dr. Destin Jenkins. Remarkable, riveting, well researched, theoretically sophisticated. These are all the wonderful things that come to mind while reading Bonds of Inequality, Debt in the Making of the American City. This book reveals the contradictions embedded in democracy, capitalism, as well as urban dispossession. Perhaps the first thing that came to mind in reading this book was, damn, this reminds me of how important discourse is to dispossession of urban residents. By dispossession, I mean how settler capitalists take land, remove people, develop that land, and create and reproduce narratives and symbols to explain why certain populations deserve to be removed, deserve less resources, and who can belong and who can't, and who can profit and benefit from that land. Dispossession within urban indigenous studies remains an underinvestigated topic within indigenous studies as a whole. Though not focusing specifically in urban indigenous populations, this work served as a model and potential jumping point for scholars who want to explore how debt and finance impact urban indigenous residents historically and today, from the creation of independent schools in Twin Cities, Minnesota, and Detroit, to the creation of alternative cultural institutions utilizing city funds or debt to fund those institutions. And the question I thought of almost immediately was how scholars from Indigenous studies can learn from bonds of inequality because they experience the same issues that other residents experience. Land is a central part of the book because it is on land where all the financial decisions are made, where buildings are being built or destroyed, and where residents are taxed. In the urban context, it reminds me of the work of Indigenous studies scholar Eileen Morton Robinson's work on the white possessive, or investment in whiteness itself as a fundamental part of who can belong in the city. Getting into the details of finance, debt, accumulation, and so forth tells us a lot about how settler colonialism also works. Those of us in Indigenous studies can talk in material and metaphysical terms about land, but it also reminds us to think critically about the nuts and bolts of colonial dispossession within urban contexts. After all, the majority of Indigenous peoples live in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, and so forth. And while Dr. Jenkins does an impressive job of making complicated numbers, financial assessments, and legislation palatable, so Sharice, I absolutely agree with you. This is very complicated, but well written and well argued and researched. He demonstrates repeatedly how financiers, bondholders, and government officials use rhetoric as another tool to disenfranchise urban residents and to justify their material actions. Let's take a look just very briefly at Chapter 4, which is called Revolt. A good example that Jenkins demonstrates is Thomas Morris, who won the Investment Bankers Association of America's annual essay competition. This is a snippet, so go and actually check out the book as you'll see, it's fantastic. Morris created an aspirational model for how bond ratings work. Jenkins quotes Morris as saying from his essay, quote, "This factor includes in the realization that accusations of being anti-Negro might be forthcoming." As a side note, of course, when you say that, that means you're about to say something racist. I think we all agree there. To continue, but the facts are irrefutable. The Negro community in metropolitan areas has a lower income, higher crime rate, higher than birth rate, and allowed educational level, end quote. Morse continues making racist statements, concluding that these cities, quote, lead to increased debt. Jenkins argues that bankers and credit analysts did not rely solely on quantitative metrics. Instead, they commented on the violation of the post-war racial contract. Instead of borrowing responsibly, and I'm quoting here, for Keynesian growth fueled by and for white middle and upper class Americans, cities were increasingly borrowing to meet the demands of minorities, or perhaps offering them a seat at the table of urban governance in ways that upended sound debt management, end quote. He demonstrates throughout the book how Morris's model was an extension of what bankers thought and tried to implement. Or as Jenkins puts it, quote, notions of racial governance were integral to the rubric and moral strictures of lenders, end quote. That is, in fact, as Cherise put it, another bar, for example. Well stated. After reading this book, I'm reminded of the disenfranchisement of urban residents, which has consisted of both quantitative metrics rooted through racist discourse about Black people. Another significant contribution of this work centers on neoliberalism. I understand the development of perhaps underdevelopment and divestment of cities in the post-war era as being related to settler colonialism. Jenkins begins and ends the book arguing, and this is towards the end quote, the social crisis of austerity, the hollowing out of urban liberal democracy, the truncation of long-term commitments of local governments to the citizenry, and the deepening of inequality, social realities, lazily treated as products of neoliberalism, financialization, or federal failure, are rooted in the politics of municipal debt, end quote. And so with that very brief and unjust analysis or thoughts on the book, I have a series just of 5 questions that feel free to engage, explore. And these are just things that I was just thinking about. And so the first one is, do you see discourse and language playing a critical role in how financiers and government officials constructed this notion of the municipal bond market? And I can also I'll send you these in the chat. I should have sent them earlier, of course, but I'll send these in the chat. The second question is, how do the arguments in the book contribute, if at all, to current works in urbanism and dispossession? Or you could more succinctly put urban dispossession. The third question, and I am certainly not an expert in this, I just heard one of my friends talk about this for a long time. Do you see any connections between your discussions of structural adjustment policies in U.S. urban areas, which has also happened in the African diaspora? That is, the enforcement of structural adjustment policies on poorer countries by the West. And of course, this is not your topic at all, but I was just thinking, brought up the Puerto Rico, and so forth, but it's just like and the issues of Black people not being able to govern, some of the things that came to mind. Second to last, what critiques do you have regarding neoliberalism and urban development and urban studies and history? You went pretty ham at it early on in the book, in the intro, which I think are fantastic, by the way. I think it's very much warranted. But just for the audience who hasn't read it, I think it'd be great to hear. Or in other words, the limits of neoliberalism. And finally, what do you hope your work can do for urban and rural residents, because you mentioned rural later on, who continue to suffer under the burden of the bond market? And that's all I have. So thank you again for writing a fantastic book. And I will turn it over. Miigwech.
It's even harder to follow now. So first of all, I want to congratulate you on really having written a phenomenal book. I read this book really with great interest, and like Professor Burden-Stelly and Professor Mays have already said, what really stood out to me, how precise and concise it is written about such a technical topic. It's engaging, and these kind of topics can very easily become very dry, but it's a very lively account where people are really at the center stage of your story, and it's a very gripping story to follow. So it was really a great pleasure to read this in so many ways, for the argument, but also the way it was written. So I wanted to start with a comment that I'm not a specialist at all on African American history, nor am I a specialist on urban history. I am a historian of 20th century Africa. I'm an economic historian, and my work focuses on the nature and the legacies of colonial economies. So in a way, I'm maybe a bit of the odd one out here, but I hope that I can maybe bring in some perspectives from my discipline, and especially from where I think Professor Jenkins and I have a shared thematic interest, and that is in the history and implications of public finance. I mean, my own work is on the development of fiscal systems in colonial Africa. I specifically focus on the invisible parts of the fiscal system through the form of labor coercion. But I want to give a couple of reflections, if that's okay, Professor Jenkins, on how I think that your book actually speaks to that literature, but maybe hasn't gotten as much recognition on what it does for the way we think, and the field of public finance, history of public finance has developed. In part, this is, I think, you articulate very well in your book all of the major contributions it makes to the way we think about African American history, to the history of capitalism, to the history, to urban history and histories of inequality and dispossession, entrenched inequalities along racial lines. But I think that there are a lot of contributions your book is making that are still kind of a little bit more silent, and that I'd like to highlight here. I think that if I think about the state of the field of kind of the history of public finance, first of all, this is a field that is very interdisciplinary. This is a field that touches from economics to political science to fiscal sociology to history, and even beyond that. But that field is traditionally very macro-oriented. The main actor is on the state. It focuses on state-society relationships, on inequalities that have been embedded, but also focuses on the evolution of the state itself. And of course, traditionally, this literature was very Europe-centered. It was really about understanding the links between long-run fiscal development and state building in the European context. And what we've seen over the last, I would say, 10 years is that this field has become increasingly more globally oriented. So scholars in the history of public finance increasingly moving to different parts of the world to think about questions of how does the fiscal system really has it shaped inequalities? And this is, of course, incredibly important when we think about this in a colonial context versus a context of a sovereign nation. What are the differences there? And I think when I was reading the book, where you really pushed some of my thinking in those domains that I wanted to share with you, is your book touches upon links between public finance, race, and inequality in ways I think that the mainstream literature in public finance does not do yet, but might be draw some inspiration from some of the kind of methods and ways of thinking that you bring out in the book. The first, I think, that was really kind of very striking to me was it is incredibly difficult, at least in my understanding, to really kind of bring out all of these strings, like lines of power and interest that are taking place more kind of like behind the curtain. So to kind of give you a more concrete example, when I work on tax systems in a colonial context, there is a very clear legal fiscal dualism in play. That means that there is a special fiscal code for the African population, a special fiscal code for the European population. So it makes it very clear where the dualism is at play and how these inequalities play out. And I'm not a specialist on American history, so I don't know what the fiscal code historically was in the 20th century, whether there were kind of like legal differences, but in case there weren't, this makes it much more difficult in a way for when we want to understand how these complex relations between inequality, race, and the public finance system at large works when they're not as explicit. And I think what your work really does is you find ways to bring that out where it is maybe not as clear on face value. So I was really struck by that and very inspired by that contribution. The second thing is I also was really intrigued by how debt should be much more at the center stage of this. We again, like when we focus on taxes, on unequal expenditure patterns, it is often again very much in the moment, but the kind of deeper mechanisms of entrenching these inequalities and some of these silent actors operating more on the background, they seem they have been very much invisible in some of the literature that I've been reading, and your book really places them at the center stage. I thought that was, again, an incredibly important contribution that I wanted to highlight, at least from the field where I'm coming from. And the final one is the focus on a more local perspective, where we can get, first of all, I think, closer to actors, groups of actors, individual actors, to bring all of these different aspects together, but also that show how much of these kind of daily experiences of people are, they're not as much related to the central state, but they might be as much related to the city where they're living in. And I think that was another really kind of interesting addition that at least the scholars in the field of history of public finance could do a lot more with. Hopefully the resources are there, the sources are there. But those were 3 points that really kind of inspired me in the book, other than the kind of myriad of contributions that my colleagues here obviously will speak to and have spoken to in all of its contributions that it does to African American studies, urban history, and so on. And then I have 3 questions. Actually, for some reason, they all ended up, like, I wrote down 3 C's. They're about capitalism. I have a clarification question and a curiosity question. So let me start with my capitalism question, because I'm very much intrigued to hear you speak a little bit about what kind of the writing process and the research process of this book that probably took many years. If you think about what you thought about capitalism when you started and what you think about capitalism right now, how has it shaped your thinking about this? I have a small clarification question, and this was related to how we're thinking about the relative importance of federal policy, because in a way, the way that you're setting up the argument and drawing us to the kind of more local context is in a way to kind of, de-emphasize what happens at the federal level, whereas there seems to be a kind of an important kind of like, architecture put in place very early in the book, where like the incentives are in a way still shaped by federal policy. So how do you kind of like, where do you kind of land on it seems there are different actors to blame, but how you kind of like balance those two in your mind. And then a curiosity, this is because I don't work on the history of the US, but I was very curious about the selection of your case study about San Francisco, and I'm sure maybe some of our listeners today might have similar questions. For me, San Francisco is it's just a very interesting choice, and I was just hoping you could speak a little bit about how you got there and whether any of the findings of your research surprised you, and how you think about the city now. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So I want to thank Asala and Howard University for hosting this event, to Jarvis and LaShawn and my co-panelists. And last but not least, to the singular Destin Jenkins, the scholar whose luminous work has brought us all together. So my co-panelists have rightfully extolled the bonds of inequality for its contributions to the field, and I echo all of these statements. And in my comment, I want to tease out the offerings I found to be most provocative and refreshing. and then close with 3 suggestions for further meditation. So the challenge of this work was how to bring bonds, at once financial technologies and ciphers for democratic ideals, to life, to wrench worlds from words scrawled on ledgers, from yield curves in mountains of financial reports and acronym-laden assessments that may, in many ways, control the crossroads of Black life and death. Dr. Jenkins' contributions are not only in the accretion and translation of data and the reading of the bureaucratic sublime, but in the elegance with which he meets this challenge of translation. You know, on the flip side, I have heard it said that, okay, stories are nice, but where is the data, right? And the bonds of inequality dives headfirst into a sometimes stifling disciplinary consensus around the horrors of numeracy, to tell a profoundly data-driven story that sacrifices none of the rightful critique of racist economic science. And as a quick aside, if readers spend some time with page 117, you will be rewarded with an expertly placed James Bond pun. The book's center of gravity, however, is, as Jenkins calls it, the infrastructural investment in whiteness, the bond supremacy, which, as he reveals, is deeply self-perpetuating in its cycles of self-defeat. So, for example, the bond offering that included stadiums, convention centers, parking lots, and pollution control creates its own ecology of discharge and effluent, in which hard and soft infrastructures do endless battle long after dollars stop flowing. So when sewers, the first, quote, real test to sell San Franciscans on debt in November of 1944 changed from, quote, as essential to a city as plumbing is to a home, that would employ veterans and protect the bay and ocean coastlines from pollution, a well-trod interest of what Nathan Hare would call white ecology, later be rejected by voters in a package including a Palace of Fine Arts. Previous discussions and forums of this work seem to raise and waffle on the somewhat moralizing question, is debt bad or good? Or more generously, can debt be repurposed for good? And here I turn to one of what I found the most provocative metaphors of the book, which has stuck with me for some time. I'm quoting here, this was a euphemism for racism, Jenkins says, an anemic way of directing attention toward unidentifiable actors and away from real estate agents, banks, and homeowners, a lame telling of openings and closings without identifying who closed what doors and how. And here it is, spider webs without spiders. Perfect. I love it. If municipal finance is amorally redistributive, cannot the spiderless web be repurposed? But who and what do we resist, target, dismantle, or overpower? And I truly appreciate what I read as a narrative that deftly eschews the categorical interest in redemption or romanticization of resistance as spectacle, slogan, or a singular ethical vocabulary for Blackness. The 3 expressions of minority political power that targeted San Francisco's racial infrastructural inequality, that is civil violence, legal challenges, and boycotts, would raise kind of obvious questions, right, of so what now and what is the way forward? And while I'm interested in this answer and to your answer to that question, I'm also admittedly skeptical of reformist efforts and suggestions that purport to engender the destruction and reconfiguration of such a web without spiders. Case in point, this, I think, immediately questions might turn and lines might be drawn to Biden's infrastructure plan and the Green New Deal. But it seems, you know, after reading Bonds of Inequality, that there is no Rooseveltian Revolution 2.0, no New Deal, but just a deal with an ever receding beginning and end. So I'll wrap up here with 3 meditations. And first is that not all infrastructure, particularly urban infrastructure, is equal in terms of length of investment, degree of maintenance, and necessary labor regimes. So I did mention hard and soft infrastructure, right? Brick in our hands or sweat on our brows. And there are, I think, important differences in types of infrastructures and public services. So for example, how do the different attendant temporal and labor regimes of a sewer bond and say financing for a playground play a part in the story? You know, do cities like Flint and Jackson, Mississippi, for example, who hold, thanks to a friend who pointed this out to me, they hold epically bloated sewer bonds. Is this because the investment in labor and maintenance was not willfully factored into the scramble? And second meditation is your choice of San Francisco, which I believe is well done. It's a beacon of liberal good. And also, as you mentioned throughout, a geography of Chinese and Japanese immigrants and workers amalgamated with or residing beside Black communities post the Second Great Migration. So white supremacy, or supremacy as the final section is titled, is indeed a furtive choreography of racial proximities, which I wonder if you might reflect further upon with us, right? So amidst Black Asian antagonisms that swept the nation in the wake of the Watts Uprising, and on its heels, the Hart-Celler Act signed into law, and as you described, you know, San Francisco's Chinatown vacillating between this tourism asset and a non-white yet not Black stain in these urban renewal financing plans. And finally, somewhat related, I'll say that phrases like geographies of finance are invoked a few times, and threads drawn between the coasts, the Wall Street of the West. So one question, one larger one I would propose would be if you considered bonds of inequality to be a spatial history, and if this would be helpful framing for future readers. And so I just want to wrap up by thanking the author for something I have never had the chance to thank you for, Dr. Jenkins. In one of our very first conversations, you offered me a piece of advice. I don't know if you remember, you said, Robin, go to the business library, pick the book you least want to read, and read it. And in this case, please don't worry. I already really, really wanted to read this book, but I'm not saying that. I'm saying that what you accomplished was, I think, the same intention behind that piece of counsel, to take a source base oft overlooked or discarded for its density and lack of narrative sheen on its face, and both tell and show the world why this matters, right? As Black families, as we speak, are living with toxic tap water and standing sewage, as we watch public schools in our Black neighborhoods, where I am right now, shutter their windows. You've gone to a place that others before you had dared not go. And in doing so, you have and will inspire countless others to do the same.
Thanks for that, Robin. Just before Professor Jenkins comes on to respond to some of the comments, I just wanted to encourage all the audience members that we have here that if you have questions, we're going to be transitioning into the Q&A section after Professor Jenkins offers his comments, but you have an opportunity to share questions that you have using the Q&A feature, and I'll be sure to lift those questions up as we transition into the dialogue and conversation portion of this evening's event. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to you, Destin, to give you the opportunity to respond to bits and pieces of so many of the questions and rich comments and reflections on the excellent book that you've offered us into the world. All right.
Woo, man. I don't really know where to start. I don't know where to start. I guess the safest place is to begin with some thank yous while, I can also figure out where I want to go. Thank you to the organizers, Asala, Howard, brilliant. Know before you go. I just love that. That's really great marketing right there. Well done. To Michelle, Christina, and Nicholas for your assistance tonight, and to, of course, all the audience members, and to Jarvis and LaShawn for reaching out over the summer. My panelists, thoughtful, engaged readers, Sharice, Kyle, Marlis, and Robin. Just incredibly grateful for your generous read, taking the time to read the work, engage with the work, and just to pose such excellent observations and questions. Anybody who's written a book will tell you that you spend years and years trying to figure out what it is you wish to say. You put it out there in the world, and I'm always surprised by the kinds of questions and observations people come back to me with. And so I thank you for pushing me. This was my offering. And I'm glad that you are now offering me something to think with. So let me just kind of see. I won't even show you guys my rough. Well, I will show you. It's crazy. So I'm just gonna say, I guess, a few things. Maybe I'll go in order and find some points of overlap. The first thing I'll start with Sharice. You just had this great point about thinking about culture, norms, sociality. And really, I want to sort of situate myself or think about myself as a historical actor who's embedded in social networks, who the book reflects my own inspirations and the conversations I've had with folks over the years. Very much influenced, of course, by Kienga Yamada Taylor's work, Race for Profit, Peter Hudson, who I met in 2013, 2014, before Bankers and Empire. We talked about what to do with the sources that and the racism of bankers for him in an international context, for me in a domestic context in the United States, what to do with the performativity of white supremacy, performance of blackface was his main question. And for me, the kind of stuff that I unearthed through the tapeworm in chapter 2 of the book. Those were conversations we had. We pushed each other. We workshopped some of our work. And so I just want to sort of say that, I'm very much influenced and part of this cohort. We've thought and pushed each other to try to think, to insist that that stuff, right, is not the gloss, it's not the lipstick on the pig. It's constitutive, in my case, of trust. Without trust, there are no underwriting syndicates. Without underwriting syndicates of various financial institutions, the bond market doesn't work. And so in that sense, it's not to sort of reify the economic or the cultural as distinct categories. My anthropologist friends have long pushed me on that, but it is to say that we can't treat one as the kind of narrative hook, leave it alone, spend the bulk of a chapter dealing with more financial matters, but the quest and challenge is to figure out how to narrate, weave together, but nevertheless insist on causality and directionality to make an argument one way or the other. So that's just a little bit about a cohort. I think also this interesting point about abstraction. By the way, Jarvis, how much time do I have? I should have asked him.
So
I have like 10 more minutes, maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You just let me know if it's time for me to, cut it short. At this point about abstraction is really interesting, Sharice, because when you said it, you said value minus worth. And you said that Black communities are devalued, Black bodies are devalued, but they're worth something. And I actually thought that you were going to do the opposite. I thought you were going to say that they have value, economic value as taxpayers, as debt servicers, but yet their communities are rendered unworthy of debt. And that's the kind of way in which I think about the ethics of debt, worthiness, unworthiness of investment. I just thought it was just brilliant, just when you offered that. And I think further meditation on value, on worth, cultural readings, of course, rooted in the sources, and to think about, what do we gain from, for instance, thinking about devalue versus worth something versus thinking about the actual value and the unworthiness of communities. What questions does it open up in the literature on finance, capitalism, you name it? You said something about people versus yield. I think you pulled a quote or section from a chapter, and I just think that that's right. That is, and I have to give a shout out to one of my advisors, Richard White, who just kind of distilled this core dynamic, which is, cities as helping me think about cities as places where people live, where they work, where they send their kids, where they have joy, where they fear for their safety, you name it. versus cities as capital, or cities in this case as yield, as tax exempt interest income. And that is the kind of core dynamic. I mean, thinking about what does it mean to be dependent on an actor, set of actors who would only view your day-to-day in terms of yields, comparative yields. And one of the ways I tried to kind of capture that, not just in narrative form, but was through the cover of the book. I mean, kind of proud of this. Shout out to my dad for helping me figure this out as well. Was a graphic artist. I mean, it really, if you look at the top, there's an ad, there's a picture of the city, San Francisco, and at the bottom, it's the yields, right? And it's really trying to highlight that tension, of course, and what it meant for these 3 Black children who appear as silhouettes to look out at both a city that was not built for them, and also to think about the implications of a city that was not built for them in the immediate, but also is going through this process of abstraction, rendered and viewed strictly in terms of yields. So all good stuff, Sharice, as always. You just are always on point. Okay, so Kyle, just terrific. I mean, one of the things, if I had to, and this is why your work is just so important, just thinking about African American and indigenous histories, colonialism, slavery, its afterlives. If I had read your work, been in conversation with you, and had the chance, really the privilege to have you read some of the earlier drafts, I'm sure you would have pushed me on land. And I think in many ways, I kind of jumped to real estate. I jumped towards commodification and property and real estate, housing, commercial office buildings, and didn't spend enough time thinking about land. And I think that probably goes back to Robin's observation, which was, is this a spatial history? What were the kind of dilemmas before my historical actors who figured out, like, how do we avoid urban decline in the context of a small landmass, limited landmass? I think there was enough room to think about land itself, what's happening with land in the bond market, you know, that would be, I would love to read some work from folks in the future who really push the envelope there. And I think land also relates to your emphasis on land also relates to Robin's, the description of Robin's work, and also this point about like time, right? What is the relationship between, say, legal time, when you bring a lawsuit, you appeal, right? And it perhaps goes all the way up to the highest court in the land, the relationship between legal time in the bond market, long-term versus short-term, and of course, geological time. And so the kind of temporality, a way of thinking across temporalities through debt, but without losing sight of the material foundation of land, and of course, the whole politics of dispossession that your work so expertly unearths and deals with. So that is kind of a limitation, or if I had to do it again, would have spent more time on the land question. Let's see. Okay, so all right, you raised the question. I'm going to get to your question about what hope my work can do for rural and urban residents vis-a-vis the burden of the bond market, because I think it relates to Robin's point at the end, and this question around like, so what do we do? But structural adjustment in the U.S. And as it relates to the global South, I mean, I try to get at this in the epilogue. The epilogue is kind of written as a call for more research, and for folks to kind of take up some of these big questions, one of which is the US and beyond. One of the things you see in the book argues is that really we're talking about a very, very small group of people who bought, sold, underwrote, rated municipal debt. In fact, you can identify who they are through the kinds of directories produced. That's a digital humanities project that I'm working on, right? To basically say, like, who are these people? Where do they work? For what firms? And what you find is, you know, just a sense of like the revolving door, or people who, if not folks working in the municipal bond division, perhaps didn't move over to the global World Bank debt side of things within a firm, but certainly part of the same social clubs, part of the same social networks. And you see the kind of satirical, in some cases, highly extractive and certainly exploitative depictions of buying and selling, lending to US municipalities and municipalities or states within the global South. That doesn't really relate to your question around structural adjustment per se, but I would say that in both cases, whether you're thinking about municipal government, states and their political subdivisions within the United States and also within the global South, debt is essential. Debt is essential, and you don't necessarily, I won't go too far with the point about neoliberalism, but I don't think you need it. I don't think you need it to explain, maybe as a shorthand perhaps, but I think debt is a pretty useful shorthand, right? I mean, as a way of most people understand it, they know of it, even if they largely think about it in terms of consumption or along individual lines, with some exceptions. So anyway, I think that's the critique I'll say about neoliberalism. It relates to Sharice's earlier point, a question about racial capitalism, and this relates to Marlis's question about how my kind of different posture towards capitalism, how that changed over the course of writing the book. I mean, I guess again, just my training was the crucial lesson was show don't tell. I mean, show don't tell. I mean, you don't need, and there's a way in which you can come to rely on these familiar, common terms or concepts to do the analytical explanatory work. And there you can sometimes miss the intricacies, whether it be changes over time or striking continuities or the fundamentals of a process by relying solely on some meta narrative. I always find it interesting. My book came out 2 months after the co-edited volume I put out with my colleague, Justin Leroy, Histories of Racial Capitalism. So folks often describe this book as racial capitalism. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's fine. But I think I just decided not to use the term. One, because I just was interested in showing and kind of unearthing, excavating the mechanics of municipal debt, which demanded its own intention. Like I had to be very deliberate and disciplined to really think about not just debt in general, but how it changes over time, along with the other kind of points of discussion that are related to debt but aren't reducible to debt. So that's why I decided not to run with racial capitalism. And how I thought about capitalism, how it changed over time. When I first began this project, maybe 2011 now, 2011, I think that sounds right. It was a lot of stuff on the firm. It was like thinking about the firm as the unit of analysis. And so, okay, I'll never forget Robin Einhorn at Berkeley suggested that I write a dissertation on Moody's, right? Thinking about Moody's as a firm, as an institution, and selling financial information. There was a time where I thought, okay, maybe I'll focus on Bank of America. But one of the striking things, I mean, and so all that is to say is like the history of capitalism, new history of capitalism, racial capitalism. I mean, the question is like, what is the unit of analysis? What are you going to use? What will you focus on to kind of unearth these stories? And at the time I thought, okay, it would be the firm. That would be my narrative anchor. And what I found when I got into the archives of Alan K. Brown, who's kind of the central figure, he's the person who allows me to tell the story. I don't tell it without his sources. You find the incredible dissension and tension within Bank of America, within a singular firm, right? Within, folks within the municipal bond department and division upset that they're not getting their just due, and upset that the folks over at the corporate bond traders are getting more praise and attention. I mean, so you can't, in other words, if you write or rely on the firm, you miss those kinds of aspects of everyday lending, and the consequences, of course, are, in terms of, determinations of creditworthiness, the ability of cities to fund various infrastructure projects. So that's how my thinking changed over time, right? Once beginning with the firm, probably overly reliant on capitalism and racial capitalism as the punchline of every other sentence, to then say, what, let's just show not tell, and really get into the intricacies, nuances of the bond business, without relying strictly on the firm, but also recognizing without the firm, right, the firms, Bank of America and its syndicate partners, were ultimately on the notices of resale, right? They were on the offerings. Without that capital from other parts of the financial institution, the bond division can't underwrite. So it's not to say that the firm doesn't matter, but it is to say when you have the sources, right? And that's the problem. So many corporations have produced or left such limited sources where the ability to kind of think about the day-to-day interactions across various divisions is very difficult to discern. Okay, let's see. All right. All right. Sorry, y'all. There was just so much. I guess there was a question about San Francisco. I've gotten it before. For me, I'll just kind of tell a personal story. My dad and I, since 2005, we've gone to a baseball stadium every year except for pandemic years, over the last 2 years. We recently came back from Denver, which was awesome. But we treat this as kind of like a sociological experiment, you know, so kind of as urbanists thinking about various urban landscapes in Cincinnati, for instance, seeing a kind of post-industrial landscape of old telecommunication buildings and factories that were shuttered but still stood as a kind of ghost landscape. And on top of that, in downtown Cincinnati, a kind of ghost landscape of commercial high-rise office buildings where no one seemed to work. And so we just kind of, as urbanists, and we focus in on who works, who's working where, who has what jobs, do people work, what kind of jobs do they have, et cetera. And San Francisco probably was the biggest conundrum of all the places we've been. We've now been to 24, 25 different cities. And it was the biggest conundrum because, as Robert, you put it right, the beacon of liberal good, the city that knows how. But when we walked from the Ferry Building down through the Tenderloin, you saw brothers and sisters struggling big time. And so that was my starting point. It was, I should say for folks, never thought I would write a book about municipal bonds. Had a very different project that I went into graduate school with. But I was interested in that question, right, of like the relationship between liberalism, a liberal reputation of a city as the beacon of good, the city that knows how, and also the material conditions and lived realities of Black folks in the city. Is that the exception to liberalism? Is that due to liberalism? If it is rooted in liberalism, how do we explain the condition of Black folks in San Francisco relative to other cities, Black folks, the lived experiences of Black folks in other cities? So anyway, all it is to say that San Francisco was this conundrum. And it was also one that, you know, at the time I was a grad student at Stanford. It was the whole reach beyond the Black-white binary, the kind of declaration, which really meant like thinking about comparative racializations, because, you know, as Matthew Desmond and his another colleague said, how do you reach beyond that which, you know, the two poles on which the racial order sits and stands, right? It's hard how do you reach beyond it? But in any event, I was interested in comparative racializations and eventually thought about why it is that a place like Chinatown in the late 1930s is seen as a slum neighborhood, but yet its kind of spatial, cultural, social integrity is allowed to remain. But a Black neighborhood in the Fillmore has the same sort of stigma, but it's subject to wholesale removal. And then trying to root that familiar story of urban renewal, differential outcomes in a history of the bond market of lending, buying, selling, et cetera. So that was San Francisco. That was the conundrum. A lot of folks, you know, have been writing about post-industrial cities, have been writing about deindustrialization, Detroit, Cleveland, Oakland to some extent, Atlanta, as you know, thinking about the city too busy to hate. So there were a lot of folks that have written these incredible case studies that were also thinking about its national implications of what a case study in particular city said about the national politics post 1945. And a lot of people said, don't write about San Francisco because they said it was too quirky. It was the exception. But as I try to show in the book, if it is an exception, it's the exception that proves the rule of the consequences of dependence on an extractive bond market. And so that's why the 1980s, where you have city officials going before credit rating analysts and others in New York, trying to perform creditworthiness, trying to secure a higher rating, trying to avoid a downgrade. This despite a city that had avoided deindustrialization, that had actually moved towards finance, insurance, and real estate, but nevertheless is still forced to perform these similar kinds of scripts. Well, we have convention centers, we have a new baseball stadium, and so forth. So the exception that proves the rule of the consequences of dependence on the bond market. Now, as such, so what do you do about it, right? What about cities and rural areas? I've given many talks before, folks in the finance world who, interestingly enough, don't disagree with any of the kind of conclusions, whether it be the kind of the importance of trust, of culture, who by and large get it, even if they think that this is a past moment, right? You know, the kind of history as that's what, that's what happened back then. It was a problem, but look how things are different now. But some folks ask the question, are things different? And the experiences of people in the financial world seem to suggest that there's a great deal of continuity. So I guess I'll just end with this. Like, when I finished the book or thought about like alternatives to dependence, I thought about the importance and promise of financial power. And this is Marlis's question about what is the role of the federal government and federal policy. The idea of the federal government as a clearinghouse of financial information, as a way to sort of obviate the credit rating agencies of the time. This is people like Wright Patman and William Proxmire who call for some kind of alternative. In this current moment, people have called for a kind of nonprofit entity that can do the work of evaluating the credit profiles. Shout out to Michael Ralph of local governments. Great work by folks who think about socialist economies, like the problem of decadence, right? You don't want to have a kind of decadent structure, a bureaucratic structure where people are just interested in preserving their own jobs and positions, such that then, even though it's not a private sector actor or corporation that does the work of evaluating municipalities, it still has this other problem of incentives and so forth. So I was drawn at the time to kind of the federal government as an alternative underwriter, alternative lender, clearinghouse of information. And to some extent, I think the municipal liquidity facility, an unfulfilled promise during the sort of early moments of the pandemic in 2020. I thought there was some great promise there. I wrote about it in the Washington Post. I guess my question is now in the context of climate change and ecological destruction. I still think, and maybe we could debate this and discuss this, that financial markets are still the quickest, most expedient way of leveraging funds. When you start to think about the kinds of bottlenecks, when you think about, in particular, our U.S. political system of minoritarian rule with the Supreme Court that could step in and undermine various legislations, even if there is a more noble, genuine way of funding infrastructure through federal financial power, to think about what's happening with the Fed, seemingly this deep political institution, but we see how they're trying to fight inflation by harming workers. So all that is to say that, okay, if that's one path, it's not the most ideal path, especially in the context of minoritarian rule. And then you have the bond market as able to deliver resources at a time when communities don't just need infrastructure now, they needed it yesterday, needed it years ago. So in that context, given the problem of time, the time is not on our side, and this is kind of relates to Robin's work, swamp capitalism. Is it possible to leverage the bond market to deliver resources that don't deepen inequality? To some extent, it's impossible because it's going to expand wealth inequality. After all, who are the people who can lend huge chunks of funds and collect tax-exempt interest income? So it may deepen wealth inequality, but can perhaps remedy some spatial inequities by delivering critical infrastructure. So inequality. So in other words, the bond market will always deepen some aspect of or dimension of inequality, even as it's able to remedy perhaps, and that's just being ideal, being an idealist, remedy another aspect or dimension of inequality. You know, I also take inspiration, this is also in the epilogue, and then I'll stop, from the NAACP and CORE, who launched this incredible campaign during the early 60s to try to leverage the bond market to discipline and undermine Jim Crow segregation in the South, using financial markets and the threat of a boycott, trying to disrupt the bond sale to try to undermine that particular regime. Of course, we see that in the context of South Africa. And so even if the bond market cannot be used to remedy the various inequities that we've discussed today and which are core to the book, can it be used, and I raise this as a question, to check some of the profoundly anti-democratic, indeed fascist movements that have taken command over state legislatures? Can financial markets, in other words, in this particular moment, be used to check those influences, even as it is a power, financial power that is profoundly anti-democratic and must eventually be dislodged and located elsewhere? Those are the big questions that I'm thinking through. I'll stop now, but just incredibly grateful to you all. Thank you.
Wow, brother, I think you did a great job. Like, you pretty much touched on, I think, most of the kind of like key questions that everyone lifted up in their comments. But in the little bit of time that we have left, I'm wondering if there's, you know, any additional comments or follow-ups that any of the panelists might have based on what Professor Jenkins shared in response to you all's reflections. You have a little bit of time if you wanted to, I don't know, expand on a point or just follow up really quickly before we turn it over to Michelle. Sharice?
So so based on exactly what you just said, I found it very interesting the way that the NAACP and CORE attempted to leverage the bond market to sort of discipline Mississippi, Alabama, et cetera. But what you pointed out was, as certain banks turned away, it created the conditions for middle-sized firms and banks to fill that void. Moreover, the other thing that you pointed out was Mississippi was able to refuse federal funding and turn to the bond market to continue segregation. So I feel like that is just a counterpoint. So I can see, and so for example, when we see like the so-called, you know, the anti-LGBT bullshit, for lack of a term, popping up in like places like Florida, they can refuse federal funding or be refused federal funding around Title IX at the same time that they can turn to the private sector. They can turn to private sources of funding to make up that shortfall and then externalize those costs through unequal taxation, et cetera, to ordinary people. And so so I don't know, that was more of a pontification, but it seems like this is a fundamental contradiction, right? And so I think, and the other thing that what you just said was, certain pockets of inequality can be remedied even as they exacerbate other forms of inequality. And I think that was astutely pointed out in your chapter that was on with rebellion, where you talked about like the ways that Black people were trying to leverage political power to disrupt bond sales for more employment, et cetera. But what you pointed out was they did not get to the bottom of the situation, that all of those demands did not get to the bottom of the situation. There were a few concessions, but the city was still fundamentally rooted in debt financing. And so it seems to me, so I don't know, not to be the pessimist.
No, you're that's not a pessimist at all. I think this is a broader question or topic, the relationship between debt and capitalism, right? And we don't have time to go there, but you could say, you know, is debt the problem, or is it the terms under which debt is contracted, the absence of a recourse or avenues of folks to resist the terms of indebtedness? Is the problem debt in and of itself, or is it the problem how debt is used? I mean, one thing you can say is that under capitalism and through relationships of indebtedness, there will always be a market for debt. Right, there will, and that's essentially the point I walk away with when you mention and recap the point of the boycott of Southern states, and smaller firms able to step in and profit from the decision of bigger firms to jettison Mississippi, Alabama state bonds. So there are folks who step in to profit from those interest rate differentials, which of course will be passed down in regressive ways. That is that under capitalism. So that's a broader question in the ways in which there are always going to be folks, whether you think about loan sharks, contract binds, the folks who rely on profiting from the truncation of life, really. So yes, that is, I think, that gets us to the point about like, the system itself, right? Debt and its relationships to the system itself. So this point, right, about like, and folks in the bond buyer were saying like, well, a boycott is good, it's noble, but the costs are going to redound to Black and brown folks, Black folks, poor Black folks through higher interest rate penalties. And the really terrible question that is just, posed by the editor at the time, I think it's John Allen, who says something like, boycotts are noble and good. These are the consequences. Is that what the boycotters really want? In other words, putting it to them as if they're the ones tripping for trying to undermine Jim Crow segregation. Now, I've mentioned this before and also floated the idea that in those instances where smaller firms then step in and charge extractive rates, the federal government should provide an interest rate subsidy and interest rate differential to basically offset, right? So if the difference, in the cost of borrowing is say 4.02% through the bond market, through a Bank of America organized sale, and 4.44% through through a smaller firm, the federal government should come in and offset that interest rate differential because it's purely extractive. It's also rooted in the political economy of racism. I've also mentioned before to folks that you have cities that were structurally disadvantaged throughout the post-World War II era through white flight and all the stuff that we know about in terms of housing, and then who are penalized further in the context of deindustrialization. So then the question is, why do they continue to be penalized? Should there not be interest rate subsidies or ways of basically offloading? Maybe the answer is debt cancellation, debt abolition of older obligations that were rooted in inequitable relations. So a lot of stuff. I just saw Michelle pop on, and so I have a sense maybe that's my time. That's my time.
Yeah, but also just once again, I want to say congratulations again to you, Professor Jenkins, for writing an excellent book. I think the fact that we can have this conversation, we can continue having this conversation, and it's a testament to the wonderful work that you did. And I want to thank all the panelists. I think you all offer very different ways of coming at this particular text and appreciating what Destin has offered us to think about with this history. And so a round of applause to you all as well for the work that you're doing and for engaging this wonderful book. Everyone that's here, if you can, go out and pick this book up and read it so that we can continue this conversation. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to close us out.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So Destin said, phew, I say, wow, 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 wow. This was fabulous. And I mean, even personally, it's so interesting. I have a history in urbanism and infrastructure. And I think I've been to more baseball stadiums than you, Destin. So we got to talk, we got to chat it up. I just really want to thank you, Destin, for coming on, for writing the book, for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us. Jarvis, Asala wouldn't be what it is without you. And this is yet another example of how you have brought the fire to what Asala does. Cherise, I loved your comments. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for your passion. Kyle, I love what you said. You talked a little bit about the land and that connection. I'm actually from Detroit too, so another whole connection there. Marlis, wow, you came from a different perspective, and that is always so good in bringing the whole to what is presented. And Robin, your connection with San Francisco and the book and your thoughts were just wonderful. Without further ado, I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank you for your participation. I hope I get to see you all in person in 2 weeks at the SALA annual meeting and conference in Montgomery, Alabama. We had the link in the chat for you to sign up to come. And guess what? If you can't be there in person, there is a virtual option as well. And when you go to asala.org to sign up for the conference, please go in the space that's social justice at Asala and learn more about what we're doing in partnership with Howard University, funded by the Mellon Just Futures Grant. Thanks to everyone. Good night. This has been great. Thank you.